What is up, action takers? Welcome back to the show. Today we're joined by Paul Smith, the author of many best-selling books, including the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, Lead with a Story, Sell with a Story, Parenting with a Story. This guy knows stories. He spent 20 years at Proctor and Gamble before he quit the job, went full-time into his career of storytelling and training corporate businesses how to tell better stories. This episode is bananas. It is bananas. Because we need to be telling better stories. If you're a podcaster, business leader, wherever you are in life, you need to be telling better stories. Stories imprint ideas into people's heads. In this episode, we're talking about the list of 10 stories that great leaders tell. We're going to explain how you can build your own list of stories. We're going to help you make sure that your stories don't suck and identifying how to turn a sucky story into an awesome, riveting, game-changing story. We're going to talk about how to keep people's attention in a story. We're going to even talk about how to get your guests and your clients to tell stories. This is the episode for you. And listen, if you're having trouble with your storytelling, if you're looking for better feedback, I cannot say this enough. You got to join a group of people that are going to be listening and engaging and giving you feedback. Link below. Join the podcast mastermind today. It's $25 a month to start. What are you waiting for? So invest in you, join the mastermind, and in the meantime, sit back, relax. Let's get into this episode with Mr. Paul Smith on how you can develop your stories. Let's go. Yo, Paul, what up? Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, Paul, I'm excited to chat, brother. I've been listening to your work, and you've got some really great methodologies put into place to help people tell better stories. And I got to ask, you were a veteran from Proctor and Gamble. How did you shift from that corporate world into your kind of like newly defined personality as a master storyteller? How did that work?
Well, it was pretty intentional. I mean, I was looking to do something different, career-wise. I'd spent 20 years at P&G, and I loved it there. But what I really wanted to do was to be a speaker and trainer. I loved those few days a year that I got to do that at P&G, but that wasn't my full-time job. And I looked around and I realized, nobody at the company has that job. There's just no full-time job of being a, keynote speaker, trainer type thing. And I noticed that the people who get to do that for a living are people who've written some best-selling book, and then they travel around the world and get to talk about whatever that is in their book. And so that's when I realized, I guess I got to write a book. So yeah, so it was really intentional. Then I chose storytelling because it was the thing that I was the most passionate about as a leader, somebody who is a leader in an organization, the thing that I thought people needed to do better. And it's what I wanted to help teach. So I spent a couple of years working on my first book while I still had the job. So it was just kind of nights and weekends project. And eventually got it finished and got an agent and found a publisher and, went through that whole route and just kind of waited to see what would happen. And the phone started ringing. I mean, people were very interested in this topic. And that first book is Lead with a Story. And I think at this point it's in its 13th or 14th printing or something. And it's in 7 or 8 languages around the world. And so clearly there was it struck a nerve. And so that gave me the opportunity to pursue a whole different career. So that's when I left the company. And that's been about a decade now. So I've been doing that ever since.
Super cool. Super cool. And I couldn't agree with you more about how I just don't feel like we talk about storytelling enough. And by the way, true after hours entrepreneur on your side, while you're working your corporate job, starting that transition into your passion project, your passion job. What was it like when you told the leadership and the bosses over at Procter and Gamble, hey, I've got this crazy idea. I'm going to go pursue this. What was that moment like?
They were surprisingly supportive. I had a great boss at the time, Kirk Perry. He's now the CEO of IRI. I think he was the president of Google for a while after he left P&G, but was very supportive. And neither of us knew if it would work out. I mean, it was just, hey, this is a passion project, doing this on the side on my own time. Might not go anywhere, don't know. But if it does, that'd be great. And if not, I'll stick around. So they were very supportive.
Well, that's definitely a good thing because it's a little bit terrifying, I think, when you take the plunge into your own thing. Were you an entrepreneur before that point, Paul, or was this kind of like your first venture?
It was. And in fact, my advice, if you want it to other people who are in my position, is be honest with your leadership about what you want to do, because I've seen this go badly other times where people would well, I'm going to do this on the down low, right? I'm not going to tell anybody. I've got the skunk works in the process of, and eventually, of course, somebody finds out about it. And then you find out, well, you should have told us all the time. We could have helped you. We could, like, I literally, at one point after the book came out, I started to get my first few clients, but it wasn't enough to make a living at. And I thought, I need to try this for another few months to see if it builds up, if I can see my way to a full-time gig in this. So I don't want to quit yet, but yet I'm out of vacation, man. I've spent all my vacation days, going and doing these few speaking engagements. And so they actually gave me a reduced work schedule. So it's one of those deals where you give up 10% of your salary and you get, another 25 days off of work so that I could go see if this would really work. And after 3 or 4 months, I'd spent all of that time. And that was my success criteria. That was the, if I can fill up these 25 days with speaking engagements, then I think that's going to be, that shows me that there's an on-ramp to a full-time gig here. But if I wasn't honest with my management about what I was doing, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So I think it's far better to go into it, totally honest with your leadership about what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish, than trying to sneak around behind somebody's back.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. And also, I find it kind of surprising that P&G would give you that type of leeway, but I mean, that I think that's definitely speaks to that company as a whole and the way they've been able to stick around. And, the relationship, that's the other problem, right? I think that when you go into entrepreneurship, like the relationships that you've built in the past are valuable. Mm-hmm. You don't just want to go around burning bridges with people and leaders like that, so I think I'm with you there.
Those people will become your clients in the future, and they have for me. So yeah, you definitely don't want to do that. That's another good reason to be upfront about it.
Yeah. So some great storytelling. You've already told like 3 stories now, and we're only 5 minutes in, which tells me that you know what you're doing here, Paul. So I kind of want to talk about, I'm just going to get right into it here, brother. I want to get into the 10 stories that great leaders tell. Okay. I run a podcast mastermind. We help podcasters launch and grow their podcasts. And this month we're working on creating a list of stories, right? And you can tell me if we're doing this wrong and kind of clean this up. But the way we started is I believe that every business, every podcaster, right, needs to have a general narrative, an overarching theme throughout their show. And the assignment for this upcoming week is to list out 25 stories that help you fulfill that narrative. Is that too broad? How can we go about actually developing or writing down a list of stories that are going to be actually relevant to our goals?
Yeah, so I've never thought about a podcast needing a specific set of stories, because the way, and I've run my own podcast. The way I've thought about them is that each episode will have its own set of stories. I would have you on as a guest, and you would share several stories. I think what you mean is the podcast needs a theme. This podcast is about podcasting, and I would have a podcast about storytelling or whatever. So I think that each business leader and each entrepreneur needs to have a set of stories that they tell that helps lead their organization, that helps sell and market the product they're selling. There are certain stories you need as a leader. I just hadn't thought about applying that concept to a podcast before, but I'm not saying it wouldn't work at all. I would think that it would, if you said there are 25 stories you need to tell in this podcast. Okay, but after 25 episodes, well, you're done then, right? I mean, or would you continue to
kind of clarify that a little bit, because maybe this is the next number 1 bestseller from Paul Smith. I don't know. We'll see. But to kind of clarify that question a little bit, right? I think that by developing these stories, it allows you to kind of, I guess, better explain or connect with your audience. Like Gary Vaynerchuk, for example, he tells the same 10 stories over and over and over again, And it just feels like it helps him to connect with an audience more powerfully. Like if I'm a guest on a podcast, for example, I can go into that bank of episodes or that bank of stories that I have, and I can apply them where needed to attract more listeners to my show. That's the thesis. You can tell me if I'm off base.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I have this list of 10 stories for leaders that I think you ought to be able to tell. And I've got a list of, actually it is 25 stories for sales and marketing people that they need to tell. So yeah, I just hadn't thought about applying that to a podcast, but yeah, you need to know what stories you need to tell so that you can go find and craft them and deliver them well, as opposed to just winging it. Every time you feel like you're in a situation where you need to tell a story, you're just making something up on the spot. That's no way to be successful at anything.
100%. So let's talk a little bit about the 10 stories that great leaders tell. Probably aren't going to have enough time to go into all of them. You've got a book out on the topic, which is en route. Hopefully they'll get here any day. I'll put a list of all the 10 stories that great leaders should tell. But hit me up with your top two here, Paul. We're like the top two stories that you got to tell. These should be the first stories that you should be telling as a leader.
Well, I mean, I could tell you all 10 right now. It doesn't take long to go through the list. The first two, though, the first four go together because they're about setting the direction for the organization. So that's where we came from. So that's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, because a strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So those are the first four. And they're, like I said, they're all about the direction of the organization, where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. And so the next four go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. So that's a corporate values and ethics story. Who we serve, so that's a customer story, a story about the customer, a personal story about the customer, so everybody in the company can have a human visceral understanding of who you're ultimately working for. What we do for our customers, so that's a classical sales story, a story about what you do that's so awesome, people should pay you money to do it. And then number 8 is how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story because it's typically the marketing department's job to differentiate you from your competitors. So imagine you can tell those 4 stories. You can very easily articulate in a human way, what we believe, who we serve, what we do for those customers, and how we're different from our competitors. So that's 8. So there's 2 more. So the last 2 are more personal to you, the leader. So that's why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And the number 10 is why you should want to work here. And not you, of course, but you, whoever you're talking to. So that's a recruiting story. So, every leader's job is to attract talented people into the organization and have them stay and follow your leadership. So those are the top 10. And you'll notice that they cross a number of functional disciplines. There's a sales story, a marketing story, an HR recruiting story. There's a leadership story there's a vision story, a strategy story. And part of the reason I picked these 10 is because I think every leader at an organization needs to be able to tell these 10 stories. Now, if you work in sales, you better have lots of sales stories, right? If you work in marketing, you better have lots of marketing stories. But if you work in engineering or HR or IT, you better have one good sales story and one good marketing story. You ought to be able to tell that. Otherwise, you really have no idea what it is your company does for a living and how you're different from your competitors. And so every leader, I think, needs to be able to tell at least this core, a couple of handfuls of 10 stories. Now, you need lots of other stories as well, but this is a place to start.
Makes a lot of sense. How did you develop all these lists of stories, right? Because, I could see as a leader, we're trying to put together these stories. Like I said, 25 randomly generated stories, but you've kind of broken it down to 10 stories. How do we get there?
Yeah, so I had 3 or 4 criteria in coming up with those. The first one was just, I looked back at my last 10 years of doing this for a living. And I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations and executives on their storytelling. And my first criteria was I wanted to pick stories that leaders were asking me for help with. And that way I knew these are a set of stories that leaders know they need to tell. So they're relevant, right? And my second criteria was that they were stories that crossed a bunch of functional boundaries that I thought everybody, these aren't just sales stories or just marketing stories or just whatever. I wanted to cover a full gamut. Thirdly, I wanted to pick stories on topics that I knew leaders needed to make an influence in a company. In other words, these are important areas, right? There are a lot of things, that need to get handled lower down in the organization, but these 10 are not on that list. And these are important topics to run a company well. And then my last criteria was I wanted to pick stories that I knew could be told over and over again and would still be relevant. So for example, your founding story, you can tell that forever, right? Companies don't get founded more than one time, right? So that story is always going to be your founding story. Your vision story, that'll change, but not every few months, right? You shouldn't have a new vision every few months. A good vision and a good strategy story ought to last you 4 or 5 years, right? And then you might need another one. So these are stories that should last a long time. So you can spend time developing it well because you're going to need to tell it a lot, as opposed to some leadership stories you might tell and you'll only tell it one time because, Well, the need is gone. The situation was there for a moment and now it's gone, and you don't need to tell that story anymore. But these 10 are ones you need to develop because you're going to tell them for a long time.
So when we're developing our stories, right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with my context or whatnot, do all these stories have to be personal stories, or can I take stories from other people? So for example, maybe something really interesting happened to Benjamin Franklin, right? Can I take stories? Can I borrow other people's stories to build out my core values of stories, or is that kind of a no-no?
Of course you can take other people's stories. Just imagine if you didn't. You know, what kind of a leader only tells stories about themselves? I mean, what would you think about somebody who only told stories about themselves? You wouldn't think very highly of them,
it's an
right?
egomaniac right there.
Yeah, exactly. That's an egomaniac, and you don't want to be that kind of leader. So most of your stories should be about other people. And of the stories that are about you, Mark, some of them should be your failure stories. So you shouldn't always be the hero of your personal stories. So some, you can be on some of them, sure, but a lot of them you need to be the GOAT. You need to tell people stories about the 3 biggest mistakes you ever made in your career. And the reason you need to tell those stories is so the people who work for you won't make the same mistake themselves, right? And people want to work for the kind of leader who will share their own failures so that you don't have to make the same mistakes they did. They can learn from your experience, right? Now, they're going to make some of their own mistakes, but you don't want them to make your mistakes on top of it. And that's why you tell them your failure stories. And that makes you a magnanimous, generous leader and not a selfish egomaniac, which is how you would come across if you only told awesome stories about yourself.
Well, it also strikes me too that failure stories, because this is something I think a lot about, help us as influencers to create empathy with our audience. Because, and I kind of think about this a lot, right? Because we want to, and had Sean Garner on last week, we were talking about creating, what was the term we used? You need to have stories create authority, right? So you need to generate authority, right? This is what I've done. This is me in front of my Lamborghini, right? These are all the books I've read. But you also, it almost comes off as fake if you're not ever talking about your failures, right? Because that's who your audience is. Your audience is dealing with these failures. They're afraid of the failures, right? That empathy helps you to connect on a deeper level. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's probably one of the most useful emotions in storytelling, is to generate empathy so that people can see what it's like for somebody else other than themselves to go through some situation, right? In fact, that second story on my list, the change story, the why we can't stay here, it's typically a story about someone who's going through something that needs to be fixed, and it's usually a sad story. It's like, this is frustrating, or this is bad somehow for me or for you or for somebody else at the company. And so we're going to make a change so that this doesn't keep happening to these people, whether it's your customers or your employees or whatever. And you're trying to generate some empathy for those people so that you will be motivated to do the work to make the change necessary to relieve them of that bad experience.
I mean, it just makes so much sense when you start laying it out like this. And it definitely, you want to head over to www.leadwithastory.com. That's leadwithastory.com to find out more about what Paul's doing. Paul, I want to keep on going here, right? Because, as we're developing out our stories, some of our stories are going to be a hit. People are going to be like, wow, they're going to get drawn in. They're going to love it. Some of our stories, let's face, they're going to suck. People are going to be like, the eyes are glazing over. They get bored. It doesn't hit the mark. How do we know if our stories suck or not?
Well, you just said it. I mean, you'll their eyes will glaze over. I mean, the same way that you're giving a speech that's bombing, or you're telling a joke, at a party that's crashing. You'll know exactly the same way. Your audience you'll have all the same physical signs of disengagement. Okay, and that tells you something. And so the problem could be you've chosen the wrong story to tell to this audience. This isn't helpful to them. They don't care, or you're telling it poorly. And it's almost always one of those two things. It's either the wrong story, and that's usually it, by the way. It's usually you've chosen the wrong story to tell. But sometimes it's a great story to tell, but you're taking 15 minutes to tell it. And it's a great 3-minute story, but it's a lousy 15-minute story, right? So you need to work on your storytelling skills. So you need to figure out which it is. Did I just choose the wrong story? Like, oh, I've got a captive audience of people and I'm trying to tell them how awesome, my weekend was, or how great I was in my last job. And guess what? They don't care because, well, you're just bragging about yourself and that doesn't help me. But like, why would I care about this? Or it's no, you're telling them about one of your failures so that they'll learn from it, in which case it's exactly the right story to tell and they really want to hear it. But you're telling it really poorly. You're giving way too many details that they don't need and it's taking too long, and you've backed up and you started over 3 times and you forgot to tell them where it was. And you violated some of the core tenets of good storytelling. So you need to figure out which of those two it is and go work on that thing. Either replace the story or tell the story better.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Because if I'm telling a story to my 5-year-old about how I was on an awesome call with Paul Smith today talking about storytelling, she's gonna be like, I just want to watch Peppa Pig.
Not going to care. Yeah, right.
No, not at least at this point. Cool. So another thing that I heard you talking about in another podcast that I was listening to, or maybe it was a keynote, was actually getting people to listen to a story, right? Oftentimes I'm tempted. I'm a kind of a just the facts type of guy, right? I don't typically like long drawn out points. When I first started this podcast, in fact, it was basically all just like straight to the facts, no storytelling, just like give me the top 10 list, right? But I found that people just get bored, or I found that personally I would listen back and I just couldn't remember any of those lists. So at any rate, I guess my question here, Paul, is how do you gear someone up and get them ready so that they're actually excited to actually hear your story and they don't think that you're just going off into a 10-minute monologue that goes nowhere? How do we get someone to actually get invested in the beginning of our story so we can hook them?
Right. Well, so first of all, it shouldn't be a 10-minute monologue. Well, first of all, it shouldn't be 10 minutes and it shouldn't be a monologue. It should be 3 minutes. And if it goes to 5, it ought to be a dialogue, right? There ought to be response coming back. But yeah, what you're asking about is the hook. You need a hook at the beginning of a story to get people to want to listen to the story. Because if they don't, yeah, they will. They'll mentally, physically, or emotionally kind of walk away in the middle of the story if they realize you're telling me a story that I'm not interested in. So that hook is the thing that gets them interested. And it's pretty simple. It's just a few words that communicates to them that if you'll listen to me for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to tell you something that's important to you, not to me, but to you. So for example, Mark, if you came to me and you were looking for advice and you told me the problem you were having, and I said to you in response, wow, Mark, that is a tough problem. Let me tell you what I did 3 years ago when I had your job and I ran into the same problem. Now, let me just stop there and ask you, do you want to hear what's about to come out of my mouth next?
Yeah, I want to know. Save me.
Right. Now, if I just started talking and started into a story without saying those words I just said, you might be confused. Like if you told me your problem and then I started out, 15 years ago, blah, 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 and I'm 3 minutes in and you still don't know, where's this going? Why are you did I miss a transition somewhere? So that transition lets them know, gosh, God, Mark, that is a tough problem. Let me tell you what I did 3 years ago when I ran into the same problem when I had your job. That lets you know that you're now notice what I haven't told you. I didn't tell you whether I successfully solved the problem or if it was a dismal failure. But it doesn't matter because you're going to learn something either way. You're either going to learn how I solved the problem, or you're going to learn one way that doesn't fix the problem that you can not use, like cross it off your list of things to try. So it doesn't, you don't need to know if I succeeded or failed. You just need to know that I'm going to tell you about an experience about somebody who is in the same position as you, facing the same problem as you, and you're going to hear what they tried. That's the hook, and people want to hear that. So now you tell your story and people are eager to listen to it, as opposed to just starting in without any transition. That hook is the thing that gets them to want to listen.
Yeah, I like that idea of a transition a lot because, I feel like sometimes someone will tell a story and then at the end of the story, you're kind of asking yourself, what was the point? Like, what does this actually reinforce?
Right.
Do you feel like so if we're starting off our story with this is, 3 years ago, I had that same problem and this is what I did. Do you feel like at the end at the end of the story, should you actually have to explain the story, or should it be should it be obvious? Should there maybe be a mixture depending on the type of story and the point?
Yeah. So when you mean explain the story, I think what you're probably asking is, do you need to explain the lesson they're supposed to learn? They should definitely understand the story because you've just told them the story. So they should understand what happened. But as far as drawing a conclusion and making a recommended set of actions after that, that is the final step. So if you get far enough into my stuff, you'll see that I have 8 questions. There are 8 questions your story needs to answer. And that first one is, why should I bother listening to the story? That's the hook that you're asking about. The last 2 questions on that list, number 7 or 8, are, what was the lesson? And what do you think I should go do now? So that's your opportunity to make a recommended action. Here's what you should go do to get yourself out of your predicament. But to answer your question, ideally, you would not answer question 7 or 8. Your audience answers it. So you answer questions 1 through 6, which is the hook, plus the next 5 questions, which basically tells the story. Then you pause and let the audience react. And what you're wanting them to do is tell you, oh, that's interesting. I think what I learned from that is this. And so what I should probably go do is that. So that's what you want them to do. You want them to draw the conclusion and them to recommend their own action, because Mark, people are far more passionate about pursuing their own ideas than they are about pursuing your ideas, right? So that's the whole beauty of a story, is it turns your idea into their idea. Now they're the ones that are coming up with the lesson and the recommended action. And so they're much more likely to go pursue it. Now, if sometimes they'll get the wrong lesson, and that's a risk you're taking with storytelling, but that's fine, because you can always redirect them. You can always say, yeah, Mark, that's an interesting lesson. I thought about that too, but I came to a different conclusion, and here it is, and here are my reasons why. So you can always redirect them if they don't get it right, but give them a chance to get it right, right? Give them a chance to come up with the idea themselves, because that's what's going to really motivate them to go do the thing that you want them to go do.
Super smart. And I would assume that if you are telling a story repeatedly and people are continuously coming to the wrong conclusion, you probably need to retool that story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You should definitely learn from that it's something about it's not working, and figure out how to fix it, or get it,
How do you do that, Paul? How do you retool stories? Do you have like a group that you're a part of, or like, how do you actually formulate them?
Well, that's part of what we teach people in the class is, right, there are several techniques that you need to use in storytelling, starting with that list of, here are the 8 questions your story needs to answer. And usually the answer is, well, you didn't answer questions 4 and 7, or whatever. Like you're not following the process. You told an incomplete story, but sometimes it's, well, you didn't create the right level of emotional engagement in the story. Your audience just wasn't, invested in your story. And so you need to, and we'll teach 3 or 4 different techniques to pull out and create the right level of emotional engagement. Or, you didn't have a surprise ending, and all good stories need a surprise ending, even leadership and business stories. And so, here are the 2 techniques to do that. And you just didn't do it. And so it didn't become an interesting, story that they're going to remember, because, there's nothing surprising about it. And that's one of the many important components of a well-told story. So we'll just, after a class, I'll give people, here's the list of things that you learned today about how to create a good story. And so this is your checklist. Every time you craft a story, make sure you cover off all of these topics, these techniques that you use, that you learned in storytelling. And if you're missing 3 of them, well, that's your problem. Go back and work on those 3.
Yeah. And Paul, listen, getting great education and feedback on stories is really tough. You mentioned you have a course. Where can we find out more about that course?
Yeah, so just my website that you mentioned earlier, Lead with a Story is the best place. It's got links there to, I've got some personal online, just one person. If you're just a solopreneur and you want to take it, you can just take it online. But if you got a team of people, we do the thing live. I'll come to your office and we'll take people through a full day training.
Brilliant. Also, everyone, you could start a podcast, which gives you access to brilliant minds like Paul's too. Side note, spoiler alert. Selfish intent over here. Paul, before we got started to, a lot of the listeners of the After Hours Entrepreneur, we're podcasters, right? We're action takers. We're podcasters. This month, like I'd mentioned, the mastermind program is focused on storytelling. And we've talked a lot about how to create our own stories, but as podcasters, we're interviewing amazing, awesome, great thinkers like yourself. We want to get our guests to tell stories. What are some ways? What are some methods? What are some examples of how we can get our guests to tell more stories?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I had to learn that the hard way. So when I started writing my first book, of course, I started interviewing all these CEOs and executives and leaders all over the world. And of course, I'm writing a book on storytelling, right? So I'm asking them to tell me their stories, because I want to get a database of these great business stories to kind of diagnose and reverse engineer to figure out what works and what doesn't. And what I learned right off the bat was what doesn't work, what does not work in getting them to tell stories. And that is asking them to tell stories. It's like, I would ask people to tell me stories, and I just wasn't getting anything interesting. And then I finally figured out, eventually I would stumble my way into getting them to tell an interesting story. And I was, oh yeah, that's the one that I'm after. And so I'd write it up and I would email it to them and say, okay, here's what I captured from that story that you told me near the end. Did I get it right? I mean, did I get all the facts right? And they would write me back and they'd say, oh yeah, you got it right. But I didn't know that's what you were looking for, because that's not really a story. That's just something that happened to me one time. And I mean, Mark is like, oh yeah, what do you think a story is? It's a narrative about something that happened to you one time. And that's when it clicked. That's when I realized people don't think of a story as something that happened to them one time. They think of a story as something that they tell a lot. They tell often. So in our minds, the word story is attached to things that we tell people a lot. Oh, I tell you the story about when I broke my arm as a kid, or I tell you the story about when I started my first company, or I'll tell you the story about when I wrote my first book. Those are stories because they're things I tell frequently. But I wasn't trying to get them to tell me things they tell frequently. I wanted them to tell me their most impactful moments in their life. And I was going to turn that into an interesting story, right? If you want people to tell you things that happen to them that might be great stories, don't ask them to tell you stories. Ask them to tell you about things that happened in their life. So for example, if you want to find out, a problem people are having at work, don't just say, what's your biggest problem? Ask them about the moment they realized their biggest problem was their biggest problem. And see, so the way I phrase that, it forces you to tell a story. So like, if I asked you what's your biggest problem right now in your business, and you'd say, oh, warehousing is our biggest problem. Well, that doesn't really tell me much. But if instead I said, tell me about the moment you realized your biggest problem was your biggest problem. Well, now you'd have to think about that and go, well, yeah, I guess that would have been a couple of months ago when our biggest customer called and gave us this like last minute, really huge order. And so we went out to the warehouse and we couldn't find enough product to fill the order. So we had to schedule a special production run and pay everybody overtime, and it cost a lot of money to produce all the product. And then we had to ship it expedited service to get it there on time. And that cost extra money. But it got there just in time. And we filled the order and we were so proud. And then we went out to the warehouse and we found all the product that we needed sitting right where it should have been all along. Okay. Well, now you know what they mean by a warehousing problem. You have a warehousing inventory location finding problem. You've got the inventory. You just don't know where it is in your warehouse, right? But the way you ask the question, you're getting people to tell you a story because they have to answer the question the way you asked it. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of something. I was listening to Donald Miller the other day, and he had mentioned that this is a really good way of selling as well. Mm. You try to understand what your audience's pain point is, right? If you're able to ask a great question that leads them to tell a story, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, like you said, oh, it's warehousing. That's too broad. You can't actually narrow down what the problem that you're trying to solve is in a case like that.
Right. In fact, I've got a whole chapter in my book, Sell with a Story, about getting your buyer to tell you stories for exactly that reason, because you need to really understand the problem before you can help them solve it. But there are other techniques too to get people to tell stories. I mean, in fact, your audience, go Google this up: Zaltman Metaphor Elicitation Techniques, ZMET, Z-M-E-T. So it's essentially a technique that consumer researchers use to force people to tell stories by cutting pictures out of magazines and building a collage with it. And you're using metaphors to help them think of stories to tell. So there are other more sophisticated techniques you can use to kind of prod people to tell you stories. So yeah, just look up metaphor elicitation technique or story elicitation techniques. But the main one is just ask a question that requires a story for an answer. And it almost always starts with words that sound like this: tell me about a time when, or tell me about the moment that, and then finish the question. And they'll almost always have to tell you a story.
Very smart. Very smart. Paul, I want to not necessarily get off topic, but I'm a father, and I find fathering, I think parenting is just so important. I take my, I got a 2.5-year-old and a 5.5-year-old, and I noticed that you have this book, Parenting with a Story. Tell me about the moment. See what I did there? Tell me about the moment you decided that Parenting with a Story was your next.
Very clever. I did notice that. Yeah, there was a very specific moment, and it was when I was writing the first book, Lead with a Story. And again, I would, like I said earlier, I would send drafts of the stories I was writing to the people whom I'd interviewed to make sure I got it right. And one of the other set of feedbacks I got during that process was, hey, it just occurred to me, I could really use some of these stories with my kids at home. As I was sharing stories from the leadership book with these people to get feedback. And that's, when it dawned on me that being a leader at work and being a parent at home, there's a lot of similarities, right? Like in both situations, you're the boss in some sense, right? In both situations, you have people who are dependent on you in some ways for guidance and coaching and their paycheck or whatever. In both cases, you care very much about their growth and development, and you want to see them succeed. So there are really a lot of similarities. And that's when I realized, people could use some of these leadership stories at home with their kids, but wouldn't it be better if we actually had stories that kids would want to listen to? Like you said, sometimes your kids are just going to be bored with your business stories, right? So I decided to interview not parents. So I wasn't interviewing people who were parents and had stories about their children. I was interviewing interesting people all over the world who had interesting things that they had happened to them as a child that totally changed some attribute of their character. So the whole book is essentially a book on character development for children. So there's 20 some odd chapters, one on each on a different character trait, like honesty and integrity, or hard work, or perseverance, or kindness, or patience, or fairness. So look up in the chapter with whatever area of character development you're struggling with your kid. And there's a handful of stories from somebody interesting around the world who learned a really hard personal lesson about that character trait, usually the hard way. Usually it was a hard lesson, right? And it works because like you probably have 2 or 3 really good life stories that will teach your kids an invaluable lesson. And I have 2 or 3 personal things that happen to me, but I don't have 100 and you don't have 100, right? But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I interviewed 100 people and got 100 really book-worthy stories, life-changing moments that taught somebody an invaluable life lesson, and just put those between 2 covers of a book for parents to share with their kids. And that's what it is.
Love that. Love that. So cool. So cool, Paul. It's something that doesn't get talked about enough either. And the stakes are definitely high when you've got a child. It's a big deal. Before I let you go, Paul, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. Who are the top 3 leaders that are just telling banana stories? 3 people that we just absolutely need to be listening to right now.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to give you a very satisfying answer because there are great storytellers at every organization. And I think what's far more useful to you is to go watch the storytellers at your company who are good at it. And you might be surprised. Like I can tell you the ones that surprised me when I was interviewing them. Like 2 of them that come to mind are Sarah Matthew and John Bryant. And Sarah Matthew was the CEO of Dun & Bradstreet. And before she was the CEO of Dun & Bradstreet, she was the chief financial officer. All right, so she grew up as a finance manager and an accountant. Not exactly the background that you would think would make somebody a great storyteller, right? And the same for John Bryant. Before he was the CEO of Kellogg's breakfast cereal people, right? And before that, he was the CFO. And he spent the rest of his career before that in the finance and accounting ranks. And again, not the kind of background you would think would lead to being a great storyteller. Yet they are. So you can find great storytellers even in places you don't think. So I would just encourage you, because you've got better access to the people, around you than you do. I could tell you, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, and you can go watch some old YouTube videos, I suppose, but you're going to be better served by watching the people around you and identify the ones whose storytelling you like and that you want to emulate instead of the one that Paul Smith wants you to emulate, and then do that. But even more important than that, and here's the other reason why I typically don't answer this question in a very satisfying way, is there are right ways and wrong ways to do this. And so you might like somebody's storytelling, but you might not be able to do it the way they do it without really being trained in it. You're just kind of watching and guessing. So, I think it's better to find a professional storytelling trainer, whether that's me or somebody else, doesn't matter, but like read a book, take a class, watch a series of training videos on the topic. So storytelling, yes, it's an art form, but you can learn it, and there are techniques that work. And so what I don't want people to do is to think, oh, all I need to do is just watch some videos by some a Steve Jobs, who's a great storyteller, and he is, by the way, and then I'll be a better storyteller. No, you won't. You know why? Because you're not Steve Jobs. So, but if you want to get better at that storytelling skill, go take a class, just like you would if you wanted to learn to play the guitar, right? You wouldn't just watch some YouTube videos of some guy playing the guitar in some awesome way. You're not going to learn it that way. You learn it by taking guitar lessons from somebody who's going to show you how to do it. So if you really want to learn it, don't just watch people who are good at it. Take a class, read a book, take some lessons. That's a better way to learn.
Yeah. So good. So good. And Paul, this actually I know your time's about, but I got one more question here for you.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this is a big one. Paul, what do you say to someone who says, I don't have an interesting story? My company startup story, my background story is lame. It's boring. It's not interesting. What do you say to someone who says they have a crappy story?
Yeah, I would disagree. I would say two things. First of all, nobody ever quit their job and risked everything to go start a new business for a boring reason. I don't believe that. There's always an interesting story because, you're risking everything, so just the fact that you're risking everything makes it an interesting story. But the other thing I noticed really early on in interviewing these hundreds of people about stories is, first of all, a lot of people say that I don't have any great stories. I know there are other people who have great stories. I don't have them. I just lead a boring life or something. I don't believe that anymore, because some of the best stories I've ever heard were from people who, by all outward appearances, would be leading a boring life. I've come to the conclusion that the people with the best stories are not the people who led the most interesting life, but they're the people who paid attention to what happened to them and wrote it down or just remembered it. And people to whom it occurred that this might be interesting and useful for somebody else if I told them about what just happened in the form of a story. Those are the people who have interesting stories. They're the people who cared enough to remember and share their experiences. And the people who didn't care enough or didn't occur to them to remember it and share it don't seem to have interesting stories.
I think we could drop the mic on that. Write it down. I really feel it. Everybody's story is awesome. It's interesting. Got to write it down though. Listen, everyone, you got to see these books are great too. By the way, Paul Smith's book, 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, can be read in less than 2 hours. Thank you, Paul. Thank you from all the people out here with busy lives. Go to leadwithastory.com. Links below. Paul, thank you so much for joining the show.
You bet. Thanks for having me on, and good luck with all the stories out there.
All I can say is, wow, Paul Smith delivered the heat. I learned a lot. You learned a lot. We all learned a lot. And I can tell you that my podcast, my business, and my sales, there's going to be a lot better after listening to this. So go out, create your own stories, join the podcast mastermind today, or hop on a call with me. I'm happy to help, happy to serve, and happy to give you the tools to grow your show. In the meantime, go take action, and we'll catch you here next time on the show. Peace.